Okay, well, I'm here with Craig Stewart. He's a fellow researcher and student of mimetic theory and the work of Rene Girard. He shares my passion for the subject, and he has a lot of great educational videos that are available online on YouTube. If you look up Craig Stewart on YouTube, you can look at some of his lectures and slide presentations, and I think he does a really superb job at going over some of the implications of mimetic theory, and it couldn't come at a more apt time because of the headlines are screaming for mimetic theory to walk into center stage of public discourse, and also there because of a few influencers in society. Rene Girard, an interest in his work seems to be higher than ever, at least in America. So thanks for joining me, Craig.
Oh, thank you for that, and I'm happy to do it. It's great.
Well, there's so many places to go, but tonight and today I want to talk about, politics and how, that's what in my work I try to use the headline news, current events, foreign policy, our justice system as a kind of trappings to bring the mimetic theory toolkit into public discourse and try to apply it as kind of a backstage influence on, what's going on. And more importantly, I'm interested in the biblical text. That's where the nuclear power comes from. That's where the radical, subversive nature and explanatory power of mimetic theory comes from. Mimetic theory is simply one of the best attempts to try to distill the radical knowledge that's in the Bible in a way that connects the dots in a way that we can receive it in a more digestible format. And I think it's probably just the surface of even beginning to look at how deep the Bible goes and its application to understanding anthropology, culture, language, all of that, right? Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. I mean, I think that's a very evangelical message in the fullest sense of the term, and I think that when it finally gets heard, it really will bring forth the transformative power that's kind of been latent within it, and maybe has been obscured and covered over for a long time, even within Christianity.
Now, some might say, well, if the Bible is so radical and so subversive, why did it take a guy from France, 2,000 years after Jesus walked the earth, to be able to unlock? Is that kind of an esoteric reading of the Bible that we're succumbing to?
That particular question is one I'm thinking about a lot, and it's just so if this message is so core and central to Christianity, is how is it that Christianity broadly considered, the whole of historical Christianity seems to have missed it, right? I mean, you don't find it formulated or brought to theoretical formulation. You don't find it in the Church Fathers. You don't find it in Catholic thought and Orthodox thought and Protestant thought. So why did it take a lone critical historian from France to be able to cobble this together? I think actually the reason ends up looking fairly complex for good and obvious reasons is that for the early Christians, what was going on in terms of the confrontation with cultures that they were experiencing, they were interpreting what was going on with those other cultures in an exclusively spiritual sense. So for Augustine, for instance, when he's encountering and evangelizing and interpreting who the pagan cultures are worshiping, he's saying, oh, they're worshiping demons. And of course, that's not in conflict with Girard's anthropological reading. In fact, you can wed the two together, I think, quite nicely. But you can see how Christianity is encountering it from within an understanding of the sacred already itself, and interpreting it within that kind of heuristic, if you want. Later on, I mean, it's not really possible to develop a kind of detached theoretical interpretation, broad theory of religion until kind of at least the late modern period and the rise of the scientific revolution and that kind of a place for a detached analysis of culture, including Christianity, to actually take place. So You can ask why didn't it happen in the 19th century? But Girard goes through, there were a lot of attempts in the 19th century. Fraser and all the rest of the thinkers he's looking at. There was the work in anthropology to try to come to a theory of religion, but they were so hostile to Christianity that they were unable to actually take seriously any knowledge that might be really contained and, God forbid, unique within the Judeo-Christian reception. So. Maybe the timing was just right, if not just a little late, and maybe it couldn't have really been done until about the time that Girard was doing it.
Well, I think a lot of this also relates to the connection that the gospel text has as a media technology. You got to think about the different forms of media technology that humans have had access to through the ages, and that you need a certain kind of media technology to be able to be subverted on a deeper, more radical level when you read the gospel text. So what I mean by that is, so when the gospel writers, they write down, what they see, the eyewitness events of the wrongful persecution of a collective against a person, their hero, their master Jesus, right? They record that. And they record how they missed the entirety of his message until they encountered his wrongful persecution and scapegoat lynching by his collective, right? They transmit that on text. That text then disseminates through mostly oral readings within a community setting, as the gospel text would circulate. And then, you get these texts, and this is where I think, again, not to give a nod to the Protestants as being superior, but I think when you have fast forward all the way to the Gutenberg press, and then where people can get the radical nuclear power, the nuclear energy of the gospel text given to them in their own language that they can take home and read, as opposed to hearing it in a foreign tongue or Latin, and the everyday family can't really fully understand what's actually happening in the text with Jesus' life. They're seeing the symbols presented to them through the church. It's when you get to the Gutenberg press and everybody can have a copy of this text and read it. And that also opens up a lot of error and craziness and all that we've had to deal with in the West. But it unleashed a kind of, I think, escalation of the gospel's infection of society's structures. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I have to absolutely agree with that point for sure. And it really is. I mean, once the gospel message went into the hands of basically democratized, if you want to put it that way, to everyone, then of course the power structures that existed, which depended on, you could say primitive practices, were themselves liable to gospel critique. And when they themselves, those power structures are holding themselves aloft as Christian culture, they're doubly susceptible to that kind of critique. And so that's obviously going to catch people's attention and was fuel for a huge revolutionary moment historically. So certainly the media changes, which then kind of create, in terms of orders of magnitude, greater exposure and, to the gospel message. I think that point is certainly right. It's still, I'm not sure that still answers the question as to why it took until Girard to actually put it together in terms of theoretical formulation. But
you have to have there's a few more media ages that come after that Gutenberg press, But just to put a little finer point on it, I think that's one of the reasons why Central America has not enjoyed as much prosperity, is that there's a lot of factors into that, but they could have enjoyed the bounties of prosperity at the same rate we were, but they were encountering people who were largely Catholic who did not give them the text in their native tongue. You see what I mean? I'm not even making an anti-Catholic point. What I am making is that when you keep it in a symbolic, enclosed surface, right? If you keep it enclosed into the symbols, right, in the church, will distill it to them behind the veil of the institution, without having the text in their native tongue. They can't go and read all the scary bits like "do not resist evil with violence," which would invalidate so many of the conquistadors in their practices. You know what I mean? So
Yeah,
See what I'm
yeah,
saying?
I do for sure. I mean, I think that there's an important kind of sociological point though that has to get injected in there in order to understand those particular dynamics, and that's and it couples with the technological innovation of the press. But that basically the entire population, for the most part, was illiterate at that time, right? So you could have shoved Bible into the hands of everyone,
But yeah,
but they wouldn't have been able to read them. But then, of course, it was the Protestant churches who emphasized the need for people to become literate and to be able to read the Bible and interpret it for themselves, more or less. That kind of gave a huge advantage to societies that widely embrace literature, because then that opened up many more opportunities in terms of commerce and technology and innovation and all the things that came along with that. So I'm not sure that I would look. I mean, we could do the Weberian Protestant work ethic sort of application there, but I mean, I'm not sure that it really is intrinsic to any kind of confessional or ordering, except for those accidental characteristics.
Yeah, what I'm suggesting is actually not that that this is somehow a proof that the Protestant church is, has the better reading on the text
Yeah.
than the other churches. What I'm suggesting is it's a kind of feature, a side effect of having that impetus to put such emphasis on the text, that you would want to translate it and contextualize it for the local culture that you're presenting it to, rather than keeping it shrouded within the the Latin and the symbols and the institution. That unleashing, whether that's the right way it should have been done or not.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what I'm asking. What I'm talking about. I'm saying it had a function that I think it's not the only factor. Obviously, there's literacy and all that, but you can see the impact of technological advancement, and with that capital accumulation, and with that preponderance of wealth that has developed in countries which have been steeped the longest in the biblical text in their own native tongue. Let's put it that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, perfectly. I completely agree with that.
So then we get into other technologies. We get into the invention of the telegraph. We get the phone. We get the television. Now we are into digital age. We have radio, and all these mediums are, in my opinion, all haunted by the same media structure that the gospel texts are. They're replaying the same story, in my opinion, unconsciously, of looking for the victim to vindicate and to take the narrative. So whether you're listening to right-wing radio and Rush Limbaugh is saying, I am here for the people who the mainstream media do not give a voice to. He's taking on the structure unconsciously. He's in the fishbowl of the gospel text. You see what I mean?
Yeah, but I think it is important to also keep the two things somewhat apart, because the search for victims, right? That just arises from the appetite structure and from the nature of mimetic desire itself, right? That we're basically always engaged in this search for someone to either worship and adore, or to blame, or both simultaneously. And that is ultimately what does the power in terms of generating the scapegoat dynamics. So all of desire is going to be taking place within whichever mediums are available for it to propagate. And so now, of course, with the internet and with the available to us today. Back to what I was saying in terms of answering the question in the first place, is that there is this knowledge of what's contained within the biblical text, all permeating all of what we could call Christian culture from the very beginning. And I think that you most especially see that in the cult of martyrs, right? Where you have these people who understand that, St. Paul says, you have not yet resisted sin to the point of shedding your blood. That the radical transformation that takes place from the reception of the gospel message to fully instantiate that and to go forth and bring it into the culture will basically necessarily mean persecution unto the point of death. This was something that was not only understood by Christians, but lived out tangibly and as a full part of their ritual participation day in, day out. So certainly the point where there is a fundamental change, shift historically that takes place with the press and with then the emphasis on the text itself. You were not going to get the discovery of the form. You were not going to get Girard's formulation of the scapegoat mechanism from yet again just following in the footsteps of Aquinas or of the Church Fathers. You really did need to have the serious of focus on the text itself, which of course the Protestant emphasis on the word really was really able to bring about. So I think you have all of these things contributing together in their own way.
And just to kind of unpack the point I'm trying to throw out there, and it's just something I'm thinking about here, which is that it's when I mention, like, for example, right-wing radio, I'm not saying that, oh, that's why they're finding scapegoats or whatever. What I'm saying is every type of cultural transmission that in the public sphere is infected by I call it they're haunted by the cross. They're haunted, and so what we do is we always covet Jesus's martyr's perch, and so we tell the story of a scandal in our culture or in the news, using media, just like the gospel writers used media, where they wrote these stories of the news of what happened in their community. But we're imitating them, is what I'm suggesting. We're subconsciously imitating them but we're always, our martyrs are always rather self-benefiting. It's always convenient because, so let me give you an example. Again, I'll use radio. In the radio narrative, Trump is a scapegoat. Populist America is a scapegoat. White men are scapegoats. The values that Christian traditional conservatives have are scapegoated. And everything, we're being victimized is the narrative. And so therefore, all news using the medium of radio or take podcast or what have you, Fox News, are all different imitations of the media of the gospel, replaying the same drama, in my opinion, but not wanting to totally repent, which would mean to take your side and not allow them to be the innocent slain lamb, but rather to admit, on Fox News television that the conservatives are no different than the Democrats, so to speak. You can't do that. You have to continually play the gospel narrative using your piece of media transmission, but you're playing through the same thing, because if you watch it, it's the passion play in 1,000 different ways. And the same goes for the leftist media. Every movie they make, every song, what is this Katy Perry song where the bad guys are a bunch of, deformed, inbred-looking Trump supporters screaming about gays, and they're always monsters, We always have to, and we're playing that same narrative that the gospel narratives gave us. And we're playing it over and over again.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's the same victimary dynamics that are going to get replayed. But although I want to refute Marshall, I think it's Marshall McLuhan, whoever said, the medium is the message. And I do want to disentangle kind of the argument and differentiate the medium from the message. The medium is where the message actually gets played out. And I think you're right, though, that with the ever increase of the available get kicked up stronger and proliferating that much deeper as the media saturates deeper into our lives. But it's the exact same victimary dynamics. I mean, each of us on the right and the left have our scapegoats. But ultimately, what I think is important to inject into that is actually a kind of a reinvigoration of a rationalist position that says, okay, well, what are the arguments? What are the actual things that we're talking about? And can we actually engage in rational dialogue to resolve these disputes rather than just mudslinging at each other and scapegoating each other, which actually, unfortunately, is the grist of the political mill. I mean, that is the mass politics writ large.
So with the digital age now where it is, where everybody has a smartphone and they can do HD video and they can do live streaming and they can get to anybody in the world, basically. You can talk to somebody in Iran who's marching in Tehran against his regime. So you can have HD video, you have crystal clear audio recording in every type of medium, and everybody has it, including very poor people in destitute countries. This is the fertile ground for the gospel technology to really set a fire. And so what I'm suggesting is, in some ways, Girard, like you said, Girard was right on time, because he brings in, I think that the scapegoat, the revelation of the scapegoat mechanism has been happening in fits and starts because of the gospel, obviously, and the proliferation of the Christian worldview. It didn't need Girard, but Girard kind of gave it a good kickstart here intellectually, right in time for the digital age to then be able to understand what the heck is going to be happening here as all of the strong structures start to get absolutely deconstructed and turned into perpetual schisms. For example, just think about it for a second. The idea that you can have a smartphone that video records a corrupt city commissioner, or video records a police beating against a man who was selling cigarettes, or what have you, right? These things are imitating, in some sense, the same, media narrative transmission of the innocence of the victim that back in the ancient days, when your myth makers, they controlled the monopoly of what was transmitted as media, except for, I guess, if you were an eyewitness. But that wasn't really allowed. You see what I mean? So what I'm saying is, there's this media evolution that had to take place at the same time for the technology of the gospel to truly start to do its work, which is can you imagine if Jesus was able to be video live stream what they were doing to him? It's an insane thought, but it would have completely, it would have what's the word I'm looking for? It would have supercharged the revelation of God to humanity, probably too much to them to handle. And so, it's
an interesting question. We might have just, scrolled past it on our news feed, and then that would have been the end of the insight.
Yeah,
I think it's the, we believe in the Holy Spirit, right? And truly we believe that the Holy Spirit is what's driving and enlightening the church. So if it is an authentic advancement, and we could say theologically, and a deepening of our understanding of who Christ is, what Christianity is, what the gospel is, God has perfect timing, in spite of our failures. So I think you're right. I think it is right now an extremely propitious moment to be engaged in this kind of work, and to have these theoretical tools and insights, and to be able to bring them to unpack and deconstruct. At the same time, though, we always want to be on our guard against throwing too much of our enthusiasm behind scandal. And I'm no any less guilty of that than anyone else. But it's these two tendencies simultaneously. One is the hypersensitivity to victims and victimization that's taking place universally and only going to continue to grow, and then the other one, and then the other side, though, is then the countervailing impulse to then feel self-righteous and justified in scapegoating those people who we feel are legitimate targets of our antipathy. It's going to be very important to really hold on to and to bring at the center as a central pillar things like due process and innocent until proven guilty and these kinds of things, as the capability of calling attention to scandals proliferates, just so that we can keep that kind of dispassionate, detached, rational approach to these kinds of things.
Obviously, there's
more difficult as the technology speeds things up increasingly, and democracy. Although it is a massive blessing that it is no longer in the hands of just a few select media executives decide which narratives that we're going to focus on and are going to be used to control the zombie populace, rather than the ability of us to do something like this or anyone else to get out and to talk about anything, really.
Yeah, it's having decentralized, highly emotive technology in the hands of everybody is fraught with tremendous downside potential and danger. There's no doubt about it. But I think overall it's a good thing, and it's a necessary thing that the gospel needs to flourish. Because I would say that one of the features of spreading the gospel that we miss in the church, and for a lot of reasons, but we are spreading the gospel when we tell the side of a persecuted victim against the collective. So what I try to do to try to begin to even attempt to do that is use whatever media technologies that I have available to me to let the victim speak. And so one of those ways is, for example, soldiers who are sent off to war for no really valid reason. There's no self-defense. There's no just war real rationale behind it. And they're sent into a meat grinder in Iraq and Afghanistan. I let them come on and speak on my radio program. Let the victim speak. Let him talk about the pain. Let his children talk if they want to. Let them speak. Or we have people call in from prison who are in prison for life for nonviolent stuff. Like one person, Craig Stewart, who comes on our show, he calls into the show from the prison phone number, and he's in prison for life for fixing trucks that were moving marijuana. So what I call that is the gospel technology of allowing the scapegoat, just like in Job and throughout the Bible, let the scapegoat speak through whatever medium you have available. We don't transcribe text as much anymore. We do radio or podcast or whatever. Just let the victim speak. You can add little logical or little lessons behind it, but really the true enchilada, the entree, is the victim, the voice of the victim. That includes their family if they're available, to tell their vantage point of the violence of the state or whatever it is, bearing down on it.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, without any facetiousness, that's obviously doing God's work there on your show. So.
Well, yeah, but what I'm saying is isn't that the entire? I'm not saying what I'm doing is the way to do it. I'm just saying, isn't that really what it means to spread the gospel, to baptize nations? You gotta let the victim speak. It's not just about. I'm not saying it's the only thing to do, but what I am saying is we have this popular notion about spreading Christianity about I got to get you to accept certain mental propositions about the worldview that I have. Who was God? He was a man that born in 0 AD. Was he fully God and fully man? Yes. Is he part of a trinity or a duopoly? Yeah. Okay. Was he fully raised physically? Yes. Okay. Who do you need to apologize to? You got to say Jesus. That's who you say uncle to. And then you check off these things, these mental propositional things that are all in the neocortex, but none of that has to do with the fullness of humanity, And so,
I mean, obviously, that's a scathing critique of something that is profoundly true of ways in which Christianity can be totally reduced to kind of philosophical categories and things like that. That being said, those philosophical and theological categories, the dogmas that have been revealed and worked out over centuries, they are extremely important too. So you can't really reduce Christ to anything, since everything was created through him, right? Even if we're studying the world and doing biology, essentially we're studying the logos there too. But certainly what you're talking about, just in terms of revealing how it is that human social order depends upon the victimization process, and then to bring especially victims who don't get their chance to speak, right? I mean, there's certain classes, like we talk about, with especially what we call the liberal mainstream media or whatever, they have their preferred victimary classes, and if you're from those classes and you say the right things, of course, you can have the brightest, most glitter-filled platform in the world to show off your victimhood, but especially where you're bringing in people who are the victims who belong to the wrong victim classes, and giving them a chance to speak in those in really odd cases of victimization. That's really bringing forth and showing the structures, if you want to call them structures of violence that inhabit all of our societies, that we all bow down and worship towards in one way or another at many different times, and often cowardly shrink back from criticizing and instead go along with. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the thing that I think we gotta try to help people see is that Girard cannot be fit nicely in mimetic theory, cannot fit nicely into some kind of social justice repertoire. To really understand, again, focusing on the biblical text, this is not a defense of, I'm not a libertarian, but I hang out with those guys, and there's a
Sure.
lot of work that needs to be done there. But there's something very powerful about the person, right? The person is what the Bible vindicates against the collective, not classes of people that tend to be scapegoated. That's very important because in the way we are right now, the satanic mechanism is trying to outcompete Christianity's protection of the person and say, hey, I'll do one better for you. How about these groups of people, because they were persecuted and are persecuted in different ways, generally speaking in different ways, we will pit groups against each other. That's just a way to revivify and try to smuggle in the scapegoat mechanism again.
Well, absolutely, of course, and we saw that we saw two major ideological attempts to do that in the 20th century, both with Nazism on the one hand and communism on the other, to put this kind of group identity against group identity, and then all of the purges that necessarily follow from that once you can label a whole bunch of a class. Sacrifice elements of a class sacrificable. So I mean, the thing about what mimetic theory does is that, I mean, it's the true constructive theory, right, of all of the avant-garde humanistic theories that claim the mantle of deconstruction. Girard deconstructs the secular social justice narrative as much as any of the rest of them, while at the same time affirming the things that they get right, like civil rights in the civil rights movement in the 20th century. That's right, but then when you want to say that, okay, and now the solution, because of that, we want to go and kill all white people. Well, no, you've just actually reproduced the mirror image of the same violence that you were actually undoing with the gospel in the first place. So it gets both. It's able to call attention to when the scapegoating is taking place in terms of victimization, but then it's also able to give the intellectual insight to show when you're just scapegoating scapegoaters and running a kind of higher order same process. So yeah.
Now, one of the things that I think is clear from my reading of Girard, and I wanted to throw it out to you, is how do you see the state surviving in light of the escalating deconstruction of violence that technology-enabled gospel revelation is doing right now? I mean, one of the big telltale signs for me that our goose is cooked is when the flag doesn't unite us anymore at our football games. That was like a big symbolic thing to me, because I thought, wait a second, there's your symbol for the national unity. And as a sports game where you put aside your violence and you channel it into this simulated violence that's very Christianized and neutered from its Colosseum origins,
Yeah.
And so, but yet you can't even get people to agree on the flag anymore. Now it's a point of contention and tearing apart. Now, we could say, well, that just means America as a government has got its days numbered. But I would say I don't think you can put the cat back in the bag, so to speak, once you start breaking these monopoly structures in terms of their believability to have credibility. And obviously we haven't reached near unanimity in a long time, but it's somewhat close to that. We can't even get there anymore.
Yeah, we still. I mean, states still have the monopolization of violence within their own domains, and the need to contain violence by violence isn't going to go anywhere anytime soon. So I think the state will, of course, continue to persist. The marked difference is the state going to become more or less Christian, and that will be, is the gospel going to, not maybe explicitly in terms of a kind of Hegelian state becoming church type of thing, but is the state going to become more in the spirit of the gospel or not, right? And then and I think that difference is going to become more and more glaring. And right now, I mean, especially in the United States, it's a difficult time. I think that difficulty has very specific historical circumstances, and I think that the media regime in the United States is actually the source of a lot of that division. that's taken place, but I think that actually it's probably going to be a temporary thing, and that America is actually. If you had asked me this, 5-6 years ago, I would have been extremely pessimistic about America's future, and it would take a lot for me to revise that assessment. But actually, as things are now, I think that once these present difficulties are actually worked through, that America's future is actually probably very bright. So,
what changed your perspective on that?
Well, I mean, for me, a major transforming force has actually been President Trump and what took place in 2016. And that I thought that the American system was so completely rigged. It was just going to be. I mean, I wasn't even paying attention to American politics because I knew the game already. It was going to be Bush versus Clinton, and Clinton wins. That was how it was already orchestrated and rigged from the get-go. But Trump came through, and with his sheer bravery and charisma. And I think actually perhaps quite a bit of knowledge into these structures and some of the things we're talking about was able to punch through all of that and drive an actual kind of replay of the 1776 revolution that has just been absolutely staggering to watch and even be a small part of it. So, yeah.
So are you saying he's a secret Girardian? I'm joking. I'm making fun, but
you know what? I'll leave it out there. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, he certainly knew how to play the role of the scapegoat and use it to gain power, right? As a kind of martyr's perch, not to degrade that word one way or the other, but the idea being his power grew because the more the media monopolies all bore down on him with all wrath and fury, it made him accumulate in the mind of his followers a martyr's power. Like, look at them, they're trying to destroy him, they're trying to disparage him, they're just and so he knew how to play that game, obviously. So whether he knows about Christianity,
he certainly knew how to dance and to channel all of what was coming towards him, and to beat them at whatever they could throw at him. So that was an active thing that he did. But also what he did by taking all that was expose all of the methods that they had been using. Their fake news, their lies and hypocrisy, their shell games, and their attempts to entrap him and to cage him in. He just punched through all of that in a way that they had no idea what to do because all of their old tricks just didn't work on him. And so it's been truly a spectacular to behold and changed my perspective on where things were headed, at least in the American context, completely.
How many Canadians share that perspective of yours?
I know at least one. No, it's weird in Canadian society because it's extremely liberal in terms of its overall atmosphere. Is that there actually are a lot of conservatives, and we've had majority conservative governments not that long ago. But as conservatives, you feel pretty alienated from other conservatives by default, just because of kind of the background of how Canada is. But we don't have any kind of the absolute corruption and craziness that has existed in the United States for a long period. I'm sure we're not perfect by any stretch of the means. We have all sorts of scandals, but there's no comparison with the States.
So would you say that Trump is a throwback to Nietzschean style figure in a seat? Because that's where I see him being effective, is that he's a heretic sitting in the sacred halls of victimary power. And for so long in the West, the way you accumulated power for yourself and social status and ultimately to be president or something was all about jockeying how you yourself, through your language and then more recently through identity, being a woman like Hillary or Obama, your identity became that calling card too. But it was most importantly about maintaining politically correct victimist language as a way of kind of obfuscating the vulgarity and violence that is the steady state, in my opinion. And that was how you won, was who could more effectively spin the mythology of victimism, of victim-garbed statecraft in a way that would bedazzle and tickle the ears of the masses the best and be blessed by the establishment with fortune to win. I see Trump as a throwback to that. I see him as a throwback to Nietzsche, winner. We're going to win. I'm a winner. I'm a winner. And he reveals the vulgarity of the whole statecraft in doing that. And that's why the leftist cathedral must destroy him. Because his language of, when he says, we shouldn't have been in Iraq, but if we went there, we should have taken the oil. It's like, you're not supposed to say that.
You're not supposed to say that.
Romantic. You're not romancing the violence enough.
Well, and doing obeisance to the narrative that's been constructed and what one should do in polite society. Right now, I mean, Trump's brilliance was just calling a spade, where everyone else had put orders of hypocrisy of political correctness that everyone else needed to imitate and follow in order to gain entry to the game at all. And of course, people love the truth, and where you get an authenticity, and when you have to deal with difficult questions, for instance, with uncontrolled immigration or something like that, and you give a hard answer, and you don't try to dance around it or cage it, you just call a spade for what it is. There was an authenticity present which automatically transformed him into a winner over all of the establishment narratives. And then, of course, his own gusto is just very charismatic and I think very likable for a lot of people, certainly for any conservative supporters.
Now here's where it becomes a little confusing for applying a mimetic theory influenced Christian ethic to these things. What Girard was clear a lot, especially in his later years, was that in order to avoid apocalyptic violence, we had to we have to renounce all of it completely, wholesale.
Sorry,
do you think?
I just missed the last word of what you said there.
It seems to be clear to me that in a lot of his writings, especially near the end of his career, he said it's essential that humanity must renounce violence or perish. So how do we take that? Obviously, you can say the tension of the gospel that many theological writers say that Christ has come, the kingdom of God has come, but it's not yet complete, right? It's already, but not yet. That tension. But how conservative can we really be in taking such a charge literally? I take it literally because I think Jesus says it literally, and I think Girard is just being faithful to what Jesus says in saying we must renounce violence completely or perish. But yet we always kind of say like a cleaning of the room, like Jordan Peterson's cleaning the room.
Sure.
It's like, yeah, we're going to renounce violence. Yeah, one of these days after we beat the libs in 2020. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, we'll clean that room, but we got to whoop some ass first.
Well, that's right. No, I think that there's a few like there's different there's of levels of violence that we're talking about. So on the one hand, there's the renunciation of violence coupled with our technological capacity, which is the most visceral and immediate renunciation that is absolutely necessary for our own survival, right? I mean, if we don't find a way to live peacefully with 12,000 nuclear warheads pointed at each other, then it will be apocalypse now, right? And that's like the most visceral and immediate and limited sense in which the nonviolence of the gospel has to become instantiated for any possibility of any kind of human future. Okay. Further on down the line, though, we can talk about our own levels of interpersonal violence and our own need for scapegoats. And in these kinds of things, Jesus doesn't just, and this is actually a bone of contention that I do have with some readings of Girard, is that it's just violence and it's not the rest of all of humanity's sinful problems. Is that acquisitive mimesis is all tied up with victimization and perceived need of superiority over against the other. And Jesus actually tells us to renounce all of it, to give all of our possessions away, to not pursue our sexual acquisitive desires. All of this he calls for us to renounce insofar as we are able. And he who can accept that full message of the kingdom shall receive incomprehensible rewards in the future to come. So there are these hierarchies, I think, of acceptance of the gospel, but that most immediate nonviolent acceptance is just a very simple, brutal, basic insight that if we don't find a way to live with each other peacefully, there won't be any future for any of us to contemplate or to occupy going forward.
But okay, so I agree with you there. But so But how do we, make sense of so much of the banal violence that takes place whenever we participate in our societies we have? Now, there's some that you can't really help. Some people say it's violent to live in a society like America, which has such a hegemonic monetary system backed by military threat. And so just by merely living and partaking in the indulgences and comfort of air-conditioned Walmart paradise that is America, you are participating in violence. There's a big thing,
Well,
if you buy a widget made in Indonesia, you are committing an act of violence, right?
I think that's that kind of self-righteous Puritanism that says, if we had lived in the times of the prophets, we would not have stoned them and put them to death. That kind of thing, No, I don't have a lot of patience for that kind of critique. What the gospel instructs us to do is to go into all of the places. If you're St. Paul, you go straight to Caesar and you proclaim the gospel. If fortune happens to bring you there, you go out, you go to the ends of the earth, wherever it happens to be, and whatever society. Look at the early Christians. Were they supposed to renounce Rome? Were they supposed to leave Rome and go somewhere else? No, they spread the gospel within Rome, with all of Rome's brutality and systemic persecution and very harsh and unchristian values held up and divinized within that state. And ultimately, of course, Rome was converted. And so we can say, oh well, then that's when it all went wrong. That's when Christianity became co-opted by the powers. But no, I think that the real historical analysis is much more complicated, and actually a success of showing just how powerful the gospel is, that the gospel can take on the Roman Empire and win. Just not according to the way that the Roman Empire would understand power.
Yeah, it broke it by ending their Colosseum games.
The whole story is very beautiful and complex, and it's something that we don't actually, that all of our contemporary anti-Christian historians that occupy the university chairs, the story of early Christianity in the first 3 centuries is a brave and daring and beautiful story, and something that I think as anyone who's living in Western civilization should know about, and it's one that basically even Christians don't really know about, other than there were some martyrs and then Constantine, and that's about it.
Mm-hmm. To me, what I see happening in that call to renounce violence is there are a few things that you can try to take away from that if you think about it. One of them, in my opinion, is that here I can just speak for the American system. Anytime you have someone, and again, not to make violence the only thing, of course, Jesus is wanting us to exorcise out of our hearts. But it is kind of the climactic, pivot point of the narrative, right? When he goes to Jerusalem, he says, "Oh, Jerusalem, if you had only known the ways of peace." I don't think he's being facetious there and saying, you couldn't figure it out, see ya. It's more like, I think he was saying, actually, there was a thing you could have done, right? There was a thing you could have done, You could have renounced the reciprocity of, your zealous desire to overthrow your occupiers and mimic their violence with your own mirror violence, which is going to come down on you and destroy you completely. So he was saying you could renounce that if you'd listened to me, but you didn't see it. And so if that's, if this is a Shakespearean play, that is an epic scene, when he says, "Oh, Jerusalem, if you'd only knows the way of peace," that's when the curtains would have stopped. You would have intermission, and then the final battle, the final gospel battle is what's going to take place next, huge.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And truly, the only new thing, the only new way that was walking on the road at that time, and the only decisive break from any of the rest of our history, which is just merely the reciprocity of violence. And I don't mind, talking about our violence as our sin. I think violence is actually a nice way of sin is kind of contaminated in the way the word sin is kind of contaminated both within Christianity and without Christianity. I think talking about violence is more intelligible to people, but it's just important to make clear that the violence actually begins, as Jesus would instruct us, within the human heart. That's actually
you're coveting your desire to cannibalize your neighbor's being.
It starts with desire. In the Bible, the biblical anthropology has always been ahead of our own anthropology, and in the Bible, We start with the fall in the Garden of Eden, and that's the need to have our mimetic superiority over and against the other, to realize our own insufficiency of being, and then to out of that construct our own little shield and to blame the other one and put the responsibility on them. And from that moment on, we're cast out of paradise. And then the very next scene, of course, is murder and the founding of the city. So it's the fall of pride, which then leads to envy and then violence. But if we just want to call that violence, obviously that's fine. It's the same sinful pattern. It goes back.
So let's bring it down to, again, the justice system that we have in America. So in our American political system, wouldn't you say that it's a performative violence? It's performative violence, and it's performatively bearing false witness to put a human being who has not injured a party into a prison cell with actual violent people, wherein he will not be able to escape. He or she does not have any means of recourse. They don't have any means of defense. They cannot jump away. They will get shot by gun turrets on barbed wire fences surrounding the prison, and they could be in there for anything nonviolent. To me, that is performing a false witness, which is the beginning of the false accusation that leads to the scapegoat mechanism. You're performing a lie because the society, when you have a person who is doing a drug or selling a drug or selling their body to a consenting adult, as ugly as that is, here's where I have a problem. Where I want to parse this out and see if we can come to some understanding, maybe with a fellow Girardian.
Sure.
There is a need to have prohibition of desire, but why must we assume that in order to have prohibition of desire, it must be backed by the initiation of collective violence? I think that's where we smuggle the pagan sacred back into a Christian moral. So it's wrong to sell your body in prostitution. That should be prohibited culturally. That should be prohibited in public square conversations. We shouldn't try to, take that away and make that normalized. But at the same time, we should never put a human being in an assault cage where they will get PTSD because they made the sin of selling their body. And I apply that for every victimless behavior.
I'll just say right at the outset that I'm largely in agreement with you in terms of the ineffectuality of coercion in terms of victimless crimes. On the other hand, there's some, look at the opioid crisis right now that's going on in the States. The United States has its hegemonic position, but the envy of all of these other states of the United States' hegemonic position causes them to do things like try to poison the entire American populace with fentanyl. That's...
Are you talking about China?
This is China acting out its resentment over the Opium War and using the same tactics on the United States, is my hypothesis for a lot of what's going on there. Coupled with, of course, all these other bad actors from Hezbollah using drug cartels out in the States. So there are these. It's on the one hand, we're always brought back to talking about violence containing violence and dealing with things, but there is a right application in terms of just application of violence to dealing with things like the criminal cartels in Mexico and in Central America.
But imagine if you, for example, if you could have opium and heroin in a nonprofit organization clinic, or imagine you could even get fentanyl. That sounds terrifying, but if you could have that, it would be in a safe environment where you would not accidentally overdose or become, or killed,
No, there's lots of places where you can look for countries who have developed kinds of very data-driven ways of dealing with these sorts of problems. So Portugal, legalized all of their drugs and adopted a harm reduction sort of approach to dealing with it. I think that the single greatest mistake in the American system has been to the application of the justice system towards drug users rather than drug distributors, right? So you have a huge number of people sitting in jail simply as drug users, which does nothing to help them. It does nothing to stop the drug problem. It does nothing to help their families. It just continues to drive up the costs in the black market to perpetuate those kind of same cycles. There is no question that the American justice system, which has been overseen by a very corrupt American establishment for quite some time now, who certainly do not have the common good as their guiding star within their heart. in ordering the society. I mean, America, I think, has, what, 25% of the prison population and I don't know, 5% of the global population total. It's massively disproportionate. There is no shortage of good critique that you can make of the present American justice system and the attitude.
But I'm making a critique of all governments. I'm saying, so let me put my card on the table about this.
I just want to finish the thought, if that's okay.
Okay,
is that I do actually think that there is a role for prohibitions even at gunpoint. I am generally in favor of especially with victimless crimes, creating a space for them. Right? The idea of red light districts was one that, I mean, even before there were red lights, every town in Europe throughout the Middle Ages and before and into Rome had a quarter of town where all the seedy business took place, and it was just understood that that's where you did that sort of thing. I think that you do have to make room for that sort of thing, or else you drive it underground and make it worse. So we can have those kinds of arguments and discussions about what is most prudent and what's the right way to do it. But overall, I don't. We shouldn't mistake the corrupt instantiation from the ideal of justice as it actually is. There is a very important place for justice systems within states, and I think states as well. Even though, of course, these things are temporary. At the end of time, they will pass away. But in the intermediate period, they are good.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say that my working, assumption is that, the scapegoat mechanism is always a sin to engage in, especially if you know what you're doing. So to me, voting, when you vote for someone who does something that you yourself it would be a moral sin for you to commit that action as an individual against your neighbor, then it's the same thing as when you vote for someone. Now, not on the same exact level, I understand, but it's practically the same. To me, to vote for someone who's going to keep policies that will initiate violence on a collective level against people for nonviolent vices and sins is tantamount to, again, performatively bearing false witness against your neighbor on a mass scale, because you're going to empower such persons, administrators of the state, to cage people for behaviors that you yourself would not ethically cage someone for. If you had a friend and you saw them down the road snorting a line of cocaine or selling a gram of cocaine, if it's your friend and you have a relationship with them, then you have the right to use, in my opinion, some level of coercion as tough love, because you have that relationship. But if it's someone that you see in a neighbor as just a neighbor that you see, you don't have the right to barge down their door with a gun drawn and invite the opportunity for them to accidentally be killed in the melee, and then cage them, tase them if they move the wrong way, and then put them in a kidnap car, and then put them into a cage where they have a high likelihood of being assaulted or raped. Just the probability that goes up 1%, you have more responsibility for that when it's engaging in behavior that does not have a victim on the report. I think that's a biblical principle, that idea of the victim must be presented. Who is the victim? Habeas corpus is relating to who is the perpetrator, but habeas corpus has a flip side in common law, which is, where's the injured party? Where is the injured party? And that's what I have to go back to. So even if it's the seller, my opinion, I want to get into this is where I've kind of come to a conclusion here, is that the wrath of God is what happens when we disobey the law of love. The wrath of God is what happens when we reinsert using violence in the satanic way to try to have a shortcut to heaven, but it leads to hell. Because whenever you try to use the violence to prohibit an object of desire, you do what Paul does, is you inflame that object's desire, you provoke people to sin, and that then leads to a violent black market, which is just a mirror of the violence that the state has employed for a no-win game. Do you see what I mean?
I do, and obviously it's a poignant critique and gets to the heart of a lot of corrupt practices that do go on. But it is important to distinguish one thing theoretically, and that's the difference between random mob violence, which against an innocent party, which is the full playing out of the scapegoat mechanism, versus institutional structures that maybe are in place, which may have dynamics of real scapegoating taking place, but are nevertheless actually trying to determine whether or not a real violation of a real statute took place, we can have real and good debates about whether or not that law is in fact just, whether or not in fact it's proportionate, whether or not the sentence really does fit the crime, and in contextual relation to everything else. Those are good discussions to have. They're inspired by, in fact, the working of the gospel through our culture and our ideal of justice and our pursuit of it. But it is different. The random the arbitrary accusations and the mob violence without due process, without the whole justice system, versus our attempt to at least to say, okay, was a crime committed? Did you actually murder those two people? It's not just a mere playing out of the scapegoat mechanism to find a murderer. Yeah, okay.
So yeah, it's a Holy Spirit infused. Holy Spirit has come into and has leavened this scapegoat mechanism for 2,000 years now, to the point where there's a lot of protections for the human person in their dignity and their right to have a fair trial, a speedy trial. I mean, look at the numbers. You have 12 jury members. The 13th person is the person that they're supposed to be judging, their peer. That's Jesus, right? So it's designed. Then you've got the judge representing the Holy Father. I mean, you see the whole pattern of it.
But there's the missing point, though, is that they're attempting to determine whether or not that's Jesus or not, right, in the eyes of the law, whether or not they're innocent. I mean, Christ was the only truly innocent victim. All of the rest of us carry some guilt around with us, or it could be but they're attempting to determine whether or not that person is innocent or guilty. And so I don't think it's the case that what can't be the case that when the law does find someone guilty of a law that is just and has all the just penalties in place, and they are treated justly with due respect for the dignity of their person and towards their rehabilitation and reintegration with society, that is that is the most Christian transformed society as it's going to get in the interim, I think. And so there is a space for all of these.
That's the best we can get.
Yeah, I mean, there's certain real problems of violence needing to contain violence that I don't think are going to be we're going to be without until the eschaton, essentially. One day we will be free from all of that, but not within the present intermediary period between the resurrection and the full coming of the kingdom.
Yeah, there's obviously, I agree with that too. On one level, I believe in a minimal, immutable form of law that is untouchable by the whims of the crowd. I think that's the way.
It's the crowd to really pay attention to, right? Because in ancient societies, and one of the areas we're talking about, things to be worried about at the present time, is just this return with the media changes towards this culture of guilty until proven innocent and scapegoat violence through just mere accusation, and we're seeing a lot more of that happening, which should give us all cause for concern.
Yeah, I want to reiterate that I do agree with you that obviously what we have is a highly Christian.
At least ideally, right. It's highly Christian. In practice,
right. But here's the thing. Here's the problem that I have, though, is that if we cannot, in public conversations, have a serious conversation in Christian culture about what is a just law, how are we ever going to have anything to? I mean, we don't even have these conversations anymore. From what I understand, it's all. We all say, especially conservatives, liberal Christians. Yeah, we need criminal justice reform. Yeah, the drug war's gone too far. Everybody's saying that. But where's the first principles that allowed us to get there? To me, I see it's very intuitive if you read the Bible, and then Girard just adds another layer of confirmation to that, which is, how can you ever exercise a collective violence against someone for something that you yourself would not morally be allowed to do as an individual? I think the casting of the first stone story illustrates what I'm talking about, right? Where Jesus says, he's exercising the crowd out of the human person in that crowd, right? Each of them has a stone, and by asking them who's going to cast the first stone, it brought them back into their own individual moral responsibility for the act of collective violence that they were about to engage in. And so the way I put it is, the modern left wants to scapegoat Jesus for telling the woman to go and sin no more. And they want to stone Jesus for that.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
And the right wants to stone the woman for being caught in adultery.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the Christian response is to not stone anybody and let it, let the story be.
That's exactly right, and I think it's from I mean, and also of course where Jesus says that the measure you use to judge others will be the same measure that's applied to you. You know, remove the log from your own eye before, and then go and see whether or not you can judge your brother. All of this is I think our Lord attempting to bring us to call into question the self-righteousness and ferocity with which processes we would happily apply to others without considering ourselves in those positions. And anything we can do to get people to think more about that and then to make that a reality instantiated in terms of our political systems, that would be obviously great. But I mean, look at on the one hand, we can look back and say how quickly things have transformed and gone. On the other hand, we're also looking back on 2,000 years of ongoing transformation, and we shouldn't be surprised that we're still caught up in bad traditions of dealing with these sorts of things and thinking about.
And I think that for me, this just brings it home. What you're saying there is that, the gospel writers themselves record that they lived among Jesus, they dined with him for 3 years, and they still didn't get it until they saw his vindication in the tomb, when they saw the reversal of the cult of the hidden corpse that was universal to all religions and mythologies. That stone rolls away. There's no corpse, which is saying the end of the hidden corpse-based logic of society is coming to a close. It's coming to an end here. And now a new world order is beginning.
That's right, and for the first time, it sets up an opposition between truth and violence. Right. Before it was always violence that had the last word necessarily, but the empty tomb was the definitive rejoinder to the argument of violence, and we would never ultimately be. No matter what happens, we don't have to ever be accept the ultimate argument of violence ever again. And that is the ultimate liberation.
See, that's where it gets messy, though. It's all because we always agree. Everybody agrees with these statements in the abstract, but then when we apply them to our own myth-making processes in our governments, which are vestiges of pagan religion. See, I say the gods really didn't leave. Odin is just called the will of the people, the thin blue line, the general welfare. Those are all words for gods, right? They're abstractions of the transcendence.
The sacred, like all energy, doesn't get created or destroyed. It just gets transformed from one thing into another, right? And
I think it's wearing out. Actually, I think the machine is falling apart.
Yeah, I hope, and I mean it's always precarious because it seems like whatever period in time in history you're looking, it seems quite precarious and often, depending on how you're looking, quite even hopeless, or like things are wearing out and breaking down. I think actually, hopefully, it's an ongoing transformation and things are getting better. I think that Christians who really do love Christ and seek Him with all their heart and all their mind and all their soul and all their strength really do want to work out what the gospel means and to instantiate it as much as possible insofar as they're able by God's grace to make that happen. And that ongoing leavening of the wider world is also taking place. I mean, you can see all of the religions and all of the governments of the world becoming, in however a confused sense, more Christian, caring more about victims, gaining more insight to the problems of violence and injustice, and so even where these things get appropriated and then twisted and turned upside down into anti-Christian sort of caricatures, that like with the social justice movement. I think actually it's rather than a wearing out, it's hopefully there's an old theological formula that says that grace isn't the negation of nature, it's the raising and perfection of nature. So grace isn't in competition with our nature. Hopefully the same thing, if Plato's right in our societies are macro extensions of our own selves, then hopefully it's our societies too being transformed and not necessarily being.
But can we ever? Why do we know so clearly that it's wrong to torture? It's wrong to you're not allowed to lynch someone in what they did in the South, where they were lynching black people. We know that's wrong. That's not even a debate. It was a debate apparently by some people at that time, which is absolutely horrendous. But and we can't judge them because again, we have the hindsight of history. And,
and we're gonna, in 200 years, they're gonna look back on stuff that we're doing now and say, like, I can't believe that they were actually having debates about this sort of stuff.
That's what I'm trying to do now. I'm trying to speed that process up.
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, and that's what I mean about Christians who really do love the gospel and love Jesus. That's all that we want. Is we're just trying to speed this thing up. We're just trying to bring more of the kingdom into existence, in however pathetic and futile our efforts may seem at the time. I think that actually really does bear fruit. It's not, and it's just the grace of God that actually does that. So, I mean, if you look at, if you were saying
His body, we are His mimetic body.
We of course.
So there's a radical free choice component to what we do. I put it this way: we're going to get Jesus. We're going to get the knowledge of the Lord filling the earth as the ocean is filled by waters, as Habakkuk says. We're going to get it the easy way or the hard way.
That's
and we always chart the hardest ways usually. But we get there one way or another,
Well, it's sort of like, and all of humanity might be like when Winston Churchill said of the Americans, they do the right thing after exhausting all of the other options, so they can be counted on to do the right thing after exhausting all the alternatives first. I think that's probably one way to look at hopefully what's going on. If of course we don't heed the message of the gospel, and I completely agree with you. That is up to us. We wanted our house given up to us. It is given up to us. Will we listen to God's word or not? And that's going to be where it goes.
So that means that we all have to become voluntarist immediately if we become aware of what God's word's telling us. I mean, that obviously I'm being sarcastic a little bit, but what I'm trying to suggest is we need to be eschatological voluntarists, which means why do the nations rage? Because God is not on their side. They represent false gods.
Well,
we need to say that more clearly. I think we need to be a little bit more. I'm not trying to be like an Anabaptist critique of working within the system. Do you see what I mean?
I do.
I'm not doing that. I'm just saying that voice has a very important. It's trying to get at something which is very important that we need to take seriously, which is that I just don't understand why we can't have a more clear conversation about applying what I think are pretty obvious ethics from Jesus to our contextual life. All you have to do, like you said, you see the macro scale, then you look at the person internally so, I mean, you can't put a gun to your neighbor's head because they're not paying the decreed minimum wage. So how could you enforce that law on a jury duty if someone was brought before that law? You can't enforce a gun to someone's head as an individual Christian if they're selling raw milk and Canada says no selling raw milk allowed. You can't do that. If they're squeezing an udder, there's nothing in the Bible, there's nothing in the person of Jesus that says drop the udder and don't even get rid of that milk mustache. You can't get away with that unless you succumb to the scapegoat groupthink bystander effect that draws us in and says, well, it's the law, and they needed to obey the law, right?
Well,
you see what I'm saying? You can.
Well, I see what you're saying completely, and I mean, if all of us fully accepted the gospel message to its full completion, with all the things we talked about before in terms of the renunciation, even of desire, right? Desire for things of this world instead of desire for. If we all did that, then we wouldn't even need to have those discussions, because it would be basically utopia on earth insofar as it's ever going to be the case. Now, to push back against some of the libertarian critique, all I would say is that living in society does mean participation in a commonwealth and a social contract, and things that we make trade-offs in terms of what we're going to accept and what we're not going to accept, and even not accepting. You take a lot of bad for the goods that you want, and the same thing goes in terms of applying your vote to voting for people who will nevertheless perpetuate systems of violence that you don't want to have anything to do with. Is that, I mean, so much of political engagement, it is actually the choice of a lesser of two evils, and you want to choose the lesser of the two evils. It's a shame that it gets reduced to that so often, and it would be like, wouldn't it be nice to be flipping that around and having choosing the more of two ideals rather than the lesser of two evils. But the pessimist can view it the same way either way. So. The pushback against that libertarian argument, which has merit and very interesting things to talk about, is the belonging to a social contract.
But I don't see how that has anything to do with what I'm talking about, because I'm assume that there is no individual. Assume that we're just a collective Borg. A collective Borg still needs to turn the other cheek to one of its little hive members, biting it by doing something that's against the rules that the majority have set. A collective Borg, if you want to take away any conception of an individual or a sovereign individual, as popular libertarian thought would postulate, and just say, no, we're all just part of a collective. A collective that is leavened by the Holy Spirit would turn the other cheek when one of its little hive members violates the order, the sacred order of the rules that were set by the majority. Well, it should turn the other cheek. It should not initiate violence.
Could we even reasonably talk about a hive member if there's no individual in the?
A member of the body, put it that way. It's not even fully sovereign. It's owned by the collective. Can the collective, if it owns you, truly be even practicing a Christian ethic for 1 second if it uses the initiation of violence to chastise violations of rules that are not based on actual violence? You didn't steal, you didn't defraud, you didn't harm children, you didn't assault, you didn't murder. So why are you touching that neighbor of yours? You're a Christian. I don't see how you can do that.
And actually, I think that spirit is very close to the spirit of a lot of the founders and what they were thinking in terms of setting up the United States. I mean, the United States is a far more, at least in its intellectual basis, a more libertarian society than most other societies. I think you can have reasonable disagreement about how much. What are the obligations of the individual to the wider social collective, and how much force and enforcement of rules can be applied, and what actually makes things go best. Those are all very interesting debates to have. I don't perfectly right answer from the basis of the critique of sin to be able to differentiate one political system from another and say that that's better.
But I'm trying to deconstruct that a little bit. I'm not saying you have to pick a system. That's why I'm not a libertarian. I have a lot of problems with the way they talk about it. What I'm saying is, as an individual, that's something we know is right. We can look at the gospel and know what we're allowed to do individually a lot, don't we? Or is there a lot of gray area? I mean, I know we can get into weird ethical games about two people are drowning, who do you save, that kind of stuff. I'm not talking about that.
No. I mean, it's clear that the obligations within the gospel are to our neighbor, which presupposes something beyond just considerations of the individual. And in fact, there's a diminution of individual. It's weird, right? I mean, the gospel explodes so many of our categories because, on the one hand, the individual is raised up to God-given dignity, right? To participation in the divine life, to identification with God, the individual is raised up, and at the same time, we're told to completely deny ourselves for the other, and there are all these obligations and debts that we owe to each other. So, I mean, teasing it out, look, these would be all of the interesting conversations to have that we don't really have, and I think a lot of the fault for that goes to something like the failure of the collective expertise sense-making establishment class in finding out, and even stating what the problems are, let alone offering up solutions and interesting discussions to think about. So.
Right. Yeah, no, and I agree with you that from this framework, I'm assuming that don't even think about the individual. What I'm suggesting is, what are we ethically permitted to do in relationship to our neighbor? That's what I'm concerned with as a Christian. So what I'm saying is the libertarian thing is a me orientation. It is my sovereign right to have an AK-47 on the edge of my property, shooting the bullets completely up in the air while being high on cocaine, and there's not a damn thing you can do about it because I'm an individual sovereign. I'm making fun, but that's the kind of mental model people have about libertarian society. What I'm suggesting is something completely different, which is take away the idea that you have an individual right to anything. It's all a gift from God. Mm-hmm. There's no inalienable right. It's a gift given and can be taken. Your hearing could be taken right now. Your liberty could be taken right now. Your life could be taken right now. It's all a gift So there is no such thing as enlightenment rights. But at the same time, what is your obligation in relationship to your neighbor, and what are you allowed to do? So if your neighbor does have an AK-47 in his house, do you have the right to send armed men with AK-47s and AR-15s to coercively steal that gun, even because he's just having it in his house and he didn't report it to the authorities? Do you have an individual Christian right to do that? I think no. I think it's obvious. I think it's obfuscated because we're still in the sacred partially. That's what I'm trying to get at.
Well,
we're still in it.
I mean, obviously, I think the answer is going to largely depend on the context in which you happen to occupy, right? Because there's going to be a lot of other factors that go into whether or not you should even need to call the bed, depending on the context in which you occupy. But the one thing to strengthen where you're coming from, I think, where the gospel is just so absolutely profound, is that there's a tendency especially among the left, and even with socially conservative minded people as well, to enforce virtue by force.
Right.
Of course, conceptions of what's virtuous and what's vicious and what actually needs to be enforced at gunpoint. The gospel really gets to the heart of the liberty out of the dignity of the human person, and so we do have infinite obligations for our neighbor. Are those obligations enforced to us by gunpoint, or are they just our obligations that we have to freely respond to? Yeah.
I want to wrap it up here because I want to see if this makes sense for why I've been harping on this point. The reason why I think this is important, not just because it's, in my opinion, the right thing to do ethically as Christians, and I want to push this into the conversation, and I think the Girard fans are the best place to try to have this conversation and start. I talked to David Bentley Hart, but boy, he you can watch my video. He does not want to break bread with anybody who's not in his camp. He's a wonderful guy, but on politics, it's a no go. I
saw a little bit of that. I really like David's stuff that I read in lectures that I watch. His political viewpoint didn't make a lot of sense to me personally, but certainly as a theologian, I have a great deal.
Yeah, I'm not taking anything away from his theology, but here's what I wanted to land the plane with this, just to give a food for thought for you and for listeners or whatever, which is, I believe that one of the things that's restored with Jesus's vindication, right? When he comes, is the dominion mandate, right? Which is to make, you start with a garden, you end in a city, right? The Genesis garden, Revelation, there's a holy city of God. So I believe we have not only a job to provide a voice for the victim of people who are being persecuted unjustly. Let them speak using whatever technology. Number two, our job is to renew creation by innovating and creating technology which alleviates the effects of scarce resources, which drives us towards these accusatory violence and vengeance cycles, right? And to give you an illustration, again, that it gets into the muddy waters of politics, but I want to see if this makes sense. For example, having a monopoly mechanism of government, like, let's say you have an FDA, a Food and Drug Administration of America, they preclude all kinds of solutions and protocols and paradigms of medicine from even being able to have a fair chance at being learned about, studied, researched properly, replicated in research, and then given to the public. Because of the way monopoly structures like governments work, they become deeply captured by the foxes that they're supposed to be guarding the henhouse from.
Yeah.
So what I'm suggesting is, if our job is to be like Christ in all of his vocation, including healing the environment without using violence and politics, healing the body of cancer and all these diseases, one of the ways that we can see that more clearly is by moving our public's appetite for the violence that allows these sacred institutions like government to maintain their control over a domain like medicine. We remove them, and in their place we look outside the box to look for solutions. For example, there's a guy in England named Dr. Michael Lisanti who's researching antibiotics. He finds them extremely effective as an oncology researcher in eliminating cancer stem cells, stage 4 cancer stem cells, using antibiotics and vitamin C. Now, because we are blinded by the scapegoat mechanism that somewhat persists with the state, we don't even know about that. We're not allowed to even talk about that. You see what I'm saying?
I do, but I look, I mean, on the one hand, you certainly want the most efficient, the most rational, the most productive systems of regulation that are available, and on the other hand, you don't want arsenic in your orange juice, right? So so you want to find the right balance of both of those things, and there are good critiques of, is shoving all of this into a centralized place to work this out? Does that have its own kind of just by nature institutional barnacles that accrete on the hull and slow everything down? Does the system have its own internal entropies that basically take over after it's been going for so long? Fine, fair enough. Those are all interesting to look at. I think that nevertheless, it's not so much those regulatory systems in principle that are necessarily the problem. It's just actually whether or not they're behaving rationally, and that they need to be subject to critique and to renewal and to working through. And that when it comes down to making it happen, these things are often quite complex and difficult. And sometimes maybe you do need just a decentralized reboot of the system and say, you know what, this thing is just too much of a mess. We'll start from scratch by just scrapping the whole thing and starting over. Maybe.
What I'm saying, you know how Thomas Kuhn said that, most scientists operate in faith about the reigning paradigm, right? The paradigm of knowledge that they're working in. If they're working in chemistry, they don't come into the field questioning the textbook knowledge. They inherit it in faith, and then they work out the details of the reigning paradigm of knowledge. You don't go into quantum physics and start challenging whether quantum physics is completely erroneous. You accept it and then you work it out. That's what most scientists are tasked with doing. And so what I'm suggesting is that paradigm shift that Thomas Kuhn says happens naturally when enough of anomalies build up in an information system. That is retarded severely by the perpetuation of the scapegoat mechanism as it exists today within our strong structures of governments. So, do you see what I'm saying? That
I do. It's just I actually would push back, looking at the problem actually more in actually patterns of imitation that are taken root. Right? People always look to people are always looking for the right thing to imitate in order to get through whatever it is that they're occupying. And if the models are bad, what do we expect to happen except worse and worse versions of already bad imitation that's taken root. So I think that's really important, and as for Kuhnian paradigm shifts, it's also important to keep in mind that paradigm shifts happen one retirement at a time. So sometimes these things just take a very long time in order to turn over. Although I have to agree with kind of going full circle right back to the beginning before the end. That really right now we are at an incredible moment just with the new opportunities that are available in terms of technology, and that new technology I think will do a lot to continue to further the aims of the gospel, and that is a much better place than just praying to government for a solution. Like that.
Yeah. What I'm suggesting is that if you're a scientist working within the field of knowledge and you've got bad role models that you're imitating, they were wrong, right?
Yeah.
The enclosure of having a monopoly-funded mechanism, which is what government is a way of retarding your ability to even be exposed to Galileo heretics that would poke enough holes within your role model's rarefied position to be able to even look for an alternative perspective and then to vocalize it in such a way that your career isn't destroyed. And it's all through this funding monopoly mechanism at the state, federal, local level of how universities are tax funded and so on. And so what I'm suggesting is violence as it exists in our monopoly of funding medicine and all the things that Christians are supposed to be at the forefront of healing and helping our neighbors with, we're failing to expose how much it's retarding our ability to move forward. because you can't move forward in this way. You need the exposure, because the witch doctor would always have his position cush, because there was no one studying microbiology that was not funded. You see what I mean?
I do. I do, and it's important to always be looking at the critique, and then what are the aims of what it is that we're trying to critique, and then obviously right now, and I think we are seeing a lot of this taking place just because Christians are being scapegoated by and large by the institutional establishment, narrative media, whatever you want to call it. A lot of attention being played to the tyranny of political correctness within these small little monopolized structures, where even if, you have to wonder within some of those monopolized structures whether or not any of them even really believe it, or do they just keep going along with what the model for imitation is because it's the model for imitation, and they all, so you wonder, I mean, that's the story. This is the quintessential emperor has no clothes type of situation, and that really seems like the moment that we're in all of these different, many different domains, and certainly, although it may not seem the most immediate in what most people are talking about, mimetic theory is one of the biggest there, because it's gonna really reveal the lack of clothing on basically the entire everything that we're calling the social sciences, humanities,
hard sciences too. That's what I'm suggesting, which is more controversial. You're not allowed to talk about that. You're not allowed to use a social theory to challenge the legitimacy of hard sciences, which is what I'm suggesting we need to really take a look at.
Well, I mean, some of the sociology of science and philosophy of science work has been trying to show, to bring out some of these failures, institutional failures of doing science, quote unquote. And that work is only going to be strengthened and further supported by better understanding the mimetic nature of desire and our situatedness within these kinds of institutions and establishments. So.
And that's why I'm long-term very optimistic. I think this is a good place to be. So it's not. We have a lot of upside for some catastrophic violence in the meantime, but we can tell the victim's story truthfully,
Yeah, it's always best of times, worst of times, both simultaneously.
So what's your millennial stance, by the way, as a Girardian? Millennial.
Yeah, I mean, or maybe non-thinking about millennial. I think about. I think that there's a lot of categories that the Christians have been tracked onto in order to differentiate their own positions in relationship to other Christians, to decide who's a serious Christian and who's not, and all these kinds of things. Like a lot of what we said, I think a lot of it is going to be up to us. That it's freedom and grace simultaneously, and so it's our the 1,000 years is going to have a lot to do with us, I think. So.
Well, I think just like Christians before us had to uncover the scapegoat mechanism of their own time, and when they did, it slowly poked holes and allowed technology to take over that vacuum of practice for solving the weather, solving medicine, solving illness. The same thing's going to happen in our time if we use this framework to expose the lie that is the need to have monopolistic initiations of collective violence. I think if we start to unwind that, we're going to have flying cars in a couple years.
Well, I think
we're going to have pollution-free, clean energy. I'm being silly, but I'm also being kind of tongue-in-cheek.
No, because
we're going to have that stuff.
Well, when you think about getting your priorities straight collectively as a whole planet, if we didn't have a lot of other things to focus on, which make the forefront of most of our present preoccupations, certainly we would be bringing in a lot of changes that would be within the spirit of the gospel, I think, for sure. And when this stuff does finally catch, and it is going to catch, then that transformation is going to be truly spectacular to behold. And so, yeah.
Well, very good. Thanks for joining me. It's been fun.
Thanks so much, David. It was fun. Let's do it again sometime.
And tell us people where you can find your work. Anything else besides the YouTube channel?
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, the YouTube channel's where I'm at right now. I have a book that I'm just finishing up at the moment. I hope to get published by, I guess, the end of the year or early next year. And I should be doing some more stuff on my YouTube channel soon. So check me out there, and don't be shy about getting in touch.
All right, very good. Thanks. Take care.
Thanks so much, David.